Hello everybody, this is Yasmin from Yarkspiri fantasyart.com, and today I'm actually going to be showing you how I go about rendering different types of textures and materials. So for these examples I'll actually be working on a sphere because a sphere has a lot of complicated elements to it, although it's very simplified. So if you're able to generally render a piece in a sphere-like form, you can normally render the piece in almost any type of form that you need to. So as I'm starting off with this basic rendering of the sphere, this is going to essentially be my template from which I'm going to be working on the other images. So as you can see, I have a highlighted area in the front, I have a cast shadow, I have reflected light that's actually coming up from behind the sphere where there's the white base essentially. And I also have a band that you could actually see too. All these elements are very important and they all highly depend on where the light is coming from. Now in this example, my light source is coming from the top left-hand corner of my canvas. So as such, I'm trying to align everything so that it makes sense perspective-wise and rendering-wise that these shadows are coming from that direction. So this is just a really basic way to do shadows, but how you actually render these shadows out will highly depend on what type of material you're actually trying to render out. Now, for these examples as well, I only use the default brushes. I use the default round brush and the default hard brush only. I did this on purpose for a couple of reasons. The main one is that to show you first and foremost that it doesn't matter which brush you're using. In this case, for my basic template sphere, I'm actually using the hard brush that's been set to a very low opacity. And because I'm machining extremely slowly, I'm able to get a large variety in the gradients that I'm actually producing for the sphere. So first and foremost, the brush does not matter. It's how you're rendering the object that makes the difference. You can have the nicest brushes in the world, but that means nothing if you don't know how to use them properly. What you just saw me do is I actually rotated my canvas when I can't get the right drawing angle. So all I did was hit the R button and it allows me to rotate my canvas to the side by doing so. Okay, so I'm just tweaking the sphere a little bit just to make sure once again that the perspective does make sense. And now I'm actually going to start a different type of rendering approach. Now for this one I'm actually trying to do a glass-like sphere. So this sphere is supposed to be made out of glass. Now in order to do this I obviously had to look at some reference. And I was looking at obviously a lot of different glass and seeing how the light was affecting how the sphere looked or how the objects would cast shadows. Now, I did realize after I actually completed this piece, the cast shadow is incorrect. At the base of the glass, it should actually be extremely bright because the light is actually mostly passing through. But for this example, I didn't really tweak the cast shadow. I kept it essentially the same for all the examples, just so you could see how I was actually going to render it. Now, what's unique to a glass sphere is that it tends to have an almost envelope around that's essentially a dark core, but then the center has been lightened up in most cases, along with a very harsh highlight. So by looking at my reference material, I noticed that, and that's the key thing, is that it's how you're actually able to interpret the information that you're seeing through your reference that makes the difference in whether or not you can normally paint it or draw it. Both techniques, either traditional or digital, both depend on that basic skill. Now this is my first attempt on this type of texture of actually painting a beaten type metal. I actually end up redoing this at the end of the video, so you'll see me actually redo this So essentially it didn't work out entirely the way I was hoping for the first time, so I let it go for a bit and then I came back to it. If you're having problems actually rendering something else, sometimes it's better to move on to a different subject matter or walk away entirely. It depends on you. I personally can normally just switch to a different subject matter, and that's enough for me. And I'll be able to figure out as I go, as I'm working on other pieces. And then by the time I come back, I've already problem solved essentially all the issues I've had with the drawing. So although the final rendering of this is okay, it looks too similar to my basic sphere, which is why I didn't keep it. Now for this rendering, once again, I was using the hard brush tool. So I wasn't using anything fancy, I was using my basic brush. And once again, I set it to a slightly higher opacity as well. So at this point, I've actually moved on to a different type of material. I'm actually going to draw more of a shiny contrast metal type sphere. So I'm changing how I'm actually approaching the elements within this to figure out how I'm actually going to draw this. Now you see me draw shiny armor in the past. I tend to make it have several different highlights within it, and actually doing this on a sphere is actually more difficult than doing it on the armor because I'm normally able to follow the contours and offset it that way. But when you're working on a sphere, although it may seem like a simple object, in order to make that object still look almost 3D and real-like, that takes a lot of skill. And this was actually one of the harder ones to do. It was actually easier than the beaten metal that I was trying to do previously, but it's still a very difficult exercise to do. Now, although you could reference 3D texture spheres and all that, I'm actually going to recommend that you don't for a couple of reasons. First of all, they're not live reference, so there's going to be some artistic licenses normally taken into account to create those pieces. And second of all, you can use them only if you're trying to figure out how the light would bend around roughly. So if you do use it very loosely. You're going to have to use it as a general idea of how the light would move around the object, but then throw it away and look at actual live reference. Look at cups, look at anything that's glassware if you're drawing glassware, look at anything that's metal if you're painting metal. It's important that you get actual live reference because, like I said, somebody who's copying from a live reference material, they're going to offer their own interpretation on how to actually render that, which may not be suitable for what you're trying to do. Okay, so now I'm actually going back to the beaten metal that I'm actually trying to do for this. So I'm switching my brushes up. I've gone back to, once again, the hard brush tool. And my focus, once again, is to really show that beaten look, that this sphere has actually been pounded into existence by a hammer. And generally, when you're tapping or actually hammering at sheet metal, you tend to actually get these grooves. Unless you're actually a professional blacksmith, you can minimize them, but you'll normally still see them at first at least. And essentially every time the hammer hits with such force that it actually creates an indent in the metal. And that's the pounded look I wanted to have in this sphere. That's a little bit more difficult actually for me to do, but I was able to do it very quickly the second time around. As you can see, that didn't take very much time at all. Now what I'm working on is I'm actually trying to figure out how to wrap around a sphere a goo-like material. So this involves me looking obviously at slime and stuff that's associated to that. I looked at slime mold as well, just to see how it gripped two surfaces. Looked at a lot of slime, ended up getting a lot of green colored slime, which is what I was trying to avoid. But I was able to eventually find some transparent slime reference that I was able to work from. Now, in the initial stages, you'll notice that I'm working very similar to my previous drawings in that I'm adding the highlights first and figuring out the general structure from there. And I'm just going in and adding some of those bump shadows just to make sure that the detail pops a little bit more out of this substance. Now, it's still too transparent, so you're seeing a hard edge as well between the sphere and the cast shadow, which I do end up removing afterwards because it shouldn't be there for this type of material. But right now, as you can see, I'm just bumping up the shadows, figuring out which areas are going to be lit, which ones are going to be darkened, how it's actually going to attach to the surface, because it has to wrap around. It's essentially a very sticky material that once this sphere has rolled onto, it's having a hard time coming apart from it. So it's a very clingy material, and that's the type of look I was going for. Now you won't see it in this recording, but you'll see it in the final image. In the final image, you'll notice that I actually added some additional highlights. These are very high class highlights. The reason why I had to do that is when I was looking at the reference a little bit further, I noticed that there was these little spots where essentially all the light seemed to just jump out and be condensed into. So for this reason, I went in after I was actually done this major portion, and I just added those really harsh highlights into the slime. And as you can see, that's what I've actually added into this. So coming up is the 5 drawings that I actually did for this tutorial. As you can see, they are fairly different. All of them have been approached in a very similar yet different manner to give you the overall textures and designs. So I hope you guys found this useful, and I hope to see you guys next week. Thank you and take care.